My name is Samantha, and although it is hard to believe now, looking back, I was only 34 years old then, and still felt like a young woman, full of strength and endless hopes that seemed to literally sprout inside me, just like tiny seeds sprout in soft, damp earth. I always considered myself completely ordinary, not standing out from others in any way, but at the same time I had one strange peculiarity that did not leave me from my earliest childhood. I loved to dirty my hands with earth, to feel how dark sand gets clogged under my nails, and my palms become rough and smell of damp clay and fresh grass. This passion appeared in me back when I was a little girl, and while other girls were running around with dolls, dressing them in fluffy dresses, and having imaginary tea parties, I spent hours in my mother's backyard, digging holes, trying to stick everything that came to hand into them, starting from the apple seeds that we ate for lunch and ending with twigs accidentally found in the park. My parents looked at me with a slight smile, confident that this was a temporary whim, that with time I would grow up and switch to something more feminine and familiar, but their expectations were never met, because my passion not only did not pass, it grew and strengthened along with me. When I turned 18, I already knew exactly what I wanted from life, and unlike many of my peers who were still hesitating and could not decide on the choice of the future, I applied to college, where there was an opportunity to study landscape design and gardening. Mom and Dad, of course, weren't thrilled. They kept trying to gently push me toward the idea that it would be wiser to choose the profession of a teacher or a nurse because it was reliable, stable, and most importantly, understandable. But I stubbornly stuck to my guns. I eagerly absorbed all the knowledge, even when it came to the most boring, it would seem, things. About the composition of the soil, about microscopic plant diseases, about how to properly prune bushes so that they would produce new shoots. After graduating from university, I worked for several years in various landscaping companies, and although this experience turned out to be useful, I was constantly tormented by the feeling that I had a fire inside that my bosses did not have. They worked quickly, saved on everything, planted cheap plants just to quickly close the order and get paid, and at such moments I literally choked with indignation. Because for me, the garden was never just an object, it was a living space that required respect and care. And so, when I turned 25, I decided to take a step that seemed both crazy and necessary. I invested all my savings into starting my own landscaping company. Fear sat inside me like a huge lump. I didn't know if clients would trust a young woman in a world where older men with rough hands and tired faces ruled for the most part. But I told myself that I had nothing to lose. The first year turned out to be a real test. I earned so little that sometimes I barely had enough money for gas and the most basic goods. I did marketing, calculated taxes, carried bags of earth and stones myself. My hands were always scratched and covered with calluses, and my eyes were red from sleepless nights. I got up at 5 in the morning and worked until dark, not allowing myself to rest even on Sundays. And sometimes, going to bed, I quietly cried into my pillow, asking myself if I had made a fatal mistake by spending all my energy and money on this risky step. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the situation began to change. The first clients were delighted that I really listened to them, took into account their dreams, and did not simply impose solutions that were convenient for me. They began to tell their friends, acquaintances, neighbors about me. And I realized that word of mouth was the main thing in this business. Yes, my services were not the cheapest, but I gave people quality, attention, and soul, and this is what was valued. By the age of 28, my business had grown so strong that I could afford to hire a part-time assistant. For the first time in my adult life, I felt financial stability, and at the same time, a new desire awakened in me. I began to dream of my own home. I was already tired of the tiny rented apartment in which I had been huddled since college, and most of all, I wanted to have my own corner of the earth, my own garden, where I could endlessly experiment, creating the space I dreamed of. I spent months looking for a suitable house, reviewed dozens of options, but each time either the prices were prohibitive or the location was too far away, and I was beginning to lose hope when I suddenly came across an ad for a small house on the outskirts of town. The house was modest and needed some work, but its bones were strong, and the backyard amazed me with its spaciousness and potential, which I saw at first glance. The previous owners, as I later learned from neighbors, had long ago given up on the house and especially the garden, and this was noticeable at first glance. Weeds were pushing through from everywhere, dry and dead bushes stood sullenly like monuments to abandonment, and the lawn was more reminiscent of a spotty, sun-scorched, muddy field than a well-kept green lawn. But looking at all this, I suddenly clearly saw in my imagination what this neglected land could turn into if you put love and work into it. And this thought gave me determination, even though the mortgage payments promised to be difficult and unprofitable. I told myself, "Samantha, you can handle it. The main thing is to continue working and developing the business." And this confidence became an anchor for me. I submitted an offer to buy and lived for 3 days as if in limbo, unable to find a place for myself, listening to my heart pounding wildly with every phone call. And when I finally heard that long-awaited voice of the agent who informed me that my offer was accepted, I screamed with joy so much that I scared myself. And then, without holding back, I jumped around my small apartment, laughing and crying at the same time, as if I were a child again who had received a long-awaited gift. I still remember the day of moving as one of the happiest in my life. Nothing special, just a modest house with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a tiny kitchen that had not seen renovation since the 80s. But it was mine. Well, more precisely, mine and the bank. But it was this thought that I finally had something of my own that warmed me so much that I did not notice the old wallpaper and creaky floorboards. Having barely unloaded the first boxes, I couldn't resist going out into the yard, as if some invisible force was pulling me there. And from that day on, every free minute became time that I dedicated to the garden. I pulled weeds, planted flowers, laid stone paths, and came up with recreation areas where one could sit with a cup of coffee and enjoy the morning sun. It turned into my obsession. I fulfilled clients' orders all day long, and when I returned home, I picked up gloves and tools and continued working until my eyes could no longer distinguish the outlines of plants in the thickening darkness. The transformation of the plot was so rapid and inspiring that sometimes I myself could not believe my eyes. In 2 years, a garden had grown from a dead patch of land that I could only dream of before. I divided it into sections: a vegetable garden, where something was always growing and green; a flower garden where the plants changed each other so that at any time of the year you could find bright colors; a corner with herbs right by the kitchen window, where I would go out barefoot in the morning to pick a fresh bunch of basil or thyme; and even a small pond in which goldfish swam, reflecting the sun's rays. All this was not just a garden. It was a living book of my life, where every page smelled of earth, flowers, and hope. One evening, when I was sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea and casually leafing through a gardening magazine, my gaze caught on an announcement of a competition for the best design of a small landscape. My heart trembled, but my mind immediately objected. "No, Samantha, you don't have a chance. There will be professionals with huge budgets and entire teams." And yet, as if guided by an inner voice, I grabbed my camera, went out into the garden, and took a few pictures. I sent them almost mechanically, not allowing myself to hope for anything, and forgot about them. 3 months later, when I had already stopped thinking about it, the phone rang. And on the other end of the line, I heard words that made me scream so loudly that the birds in the garden flew away in all directions. I won first place in the category Small Landscape Design. The organizers wanted to publish an article about my garden and interview me about the process. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, hugging myself, and repeated out loud, "Is this really true? My garden in a magazine that will be seen all over the country?" This success was sweet and long awaited, But even then, I did not allow myself to forget about the main goal, to pay off the mortgage as quickly as possible. I decided that every dollar that came into my hands would go there, to the treasury, and I lived by this rule. I did not go on vacation, did not buy new clothes unless the old ones were completely torn, continued to drive the same battered truck that I got from my college years. My friends would shake their heads and say, "Samantha, you're crazy. Your business is thriving and you're living like a poor student." But I'd just smile and say, "I have a plan." I worked 60 hours a week, took any job I could, and saved every penny to pay off the debt. Sometimes I felt deprived when I saw my friends posting vacation photos or bragging about their purchases, while I was sitting at home with a bowl of cheap noodles and mending yet another hole in my work clothes. But whenever sadness arose within me, I went out into my garden, walked along the paths, touched the leaves and flowers, and reminded myself, this is for a dream, for a future, for security. And now, at 34, I stood on the porch and knew this house was entirely mine. No bank owned its walls or my life anymore. The feeling was so powerful and bright that I could hardly restrain myself from screaming with happiness. I realized that I had to share this moment with my closest ones and celebrate it with my family. My elder brother Marcus was 37 then, had been married for 10 years to Sarah, a woman with a sharp tongue and a difficult character, and they had 2 boys, Jake, who had just turned 11, and Tommy, who had just turned 7. They lived in a cramped rented flat where each new week brought new bills and new reasons for worry, and hard as it was for me, for 3 years I helped them pay the rent, knowing that without this support they would hardly stay afloat. On my rare weekends, the boys often came to me, and I always welcomed them with joy, although they turned my garden into a football pitch, then a pirate ship, and sometimes it took me hours to restore order after their games. But still, their laughter and delighted cries filled my home with living warmth. Sarah usually brought them herself, and each of her visits turned into a small lecture on how to live. She slowly walked through the rooms, touched the furniture or the walls with her hand, and always said something like, "It must be an incredible blessing to have so much space." And her gaze always slid over the spacious living room, as if she were trying it on. Then, looking at the yard where the boys ran around racing, she said, "The children would be incredibly happy if they had a garden like this." I smiled politely, changed the subject, but her words each time left a thin mark on me, like a scratch that could not be simply erased. A week after I made the last payment on the mortgage, and for the first time in many years felt completely free, I allowed myself a small luxury. I bought an expensive chocolate cake, which always seemed to me a symbol of the holiday, and a bottle of good wine, deciding that this was how I would celebrate this event with my loved ones. Saturday night was perfect, as my parents traditionally invited Marcus and his family over for dinner, and I knew I could announce my victory to everyone at once. When I walked into my parents' house, the air was already filled with the familiar smells of grilled meat and spices. And in the living room, I saw Jake and Tommy, who were sitting in front of the TV, excitedly shouting at each other, pressing the buttons of their controllers. I set the cake and wine on the kitchen table, feeling my heart speed up with anticipation. And then my mother, noticing my bag, asked, "What is the treat for?" I smiled, and trying to hide the tremor in my voice, answered, "I have a surprise for everyone." Mom just waved me off. First dinner, then surprises, and called everyone to the table. We sat down, and everything went on as usual. Dad poured soup, Marcus ate silently, and Sarah didn't miss a minute to complain about her life, about how their landlord had raised the rent again, how the apartment couldn't accommodate everything the children needed, how the neighbors were noisy. My parents listened attentively, nodding and agreeing, as if confirming that her words were true, and I felt like my gift, the good news, was slowly burning out inside me, but I still waited for my moment. Finally, I got the chance to speak. I put my fork down, looked at each of us in turn, and said, "I have news to share. I finally paid off the mortgage. Now my house is completely mine." A deathly silence reigned at the table. Only the abrupt sounds of a children's video game came from the living room, and the silence at the table lasted so long that it seemed as if time had stopped. My mother was the first to break the silence. She said, "Oh, well, that's very sweet, dear." Her voice flat as if she were reading someone else's words from a piece of paper, without joy or surprise. Marcus just chuckled briefly and continued chewing, not looking up from his plate. Sarah, on the other hand, changed her face so quickly that I could hardly follow it. Surprise flashed in her eyes, immediately gave way to irritation. Then she smiled tightly, feigning joy, and frowned again. "Well, congratulations," she finally said, and there was such false warmth in her voice that a chill ran down my spine. Then she added with real annoyance, "But honestly, it's not fair. You don't have a husband and kids like we do. You're just lucky that you were able to buy your own house while Marcus and I are stuck in a rented apartment with kids." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and said, "The truth is, I've been unlucky. I've worked incredibly hard to build my business, buy this house, and pay off my mortgage. I've spent 9 years sacrificing everything, denying myself everything to achieve this goal." And then Sarah suddenly threw her fork down on the table with a bang, shaking the glasses, and said, "You talk about yourself all the time, but you forget that you have a family, Samantha, and that means your house is the family property. Marcus and I have a claim on it, too." I was shocked by her words, such twisted logic and the smug tone with which she said them. "This is my house," I said firmly, "my personal property. No one but me has anything to do with it." But Sarah was not going to back down. She suddenly burst into loud, deliberately heart-rending sobs, buried her face in her hands, and then turned to Marcus, as if seeking his protection, and said in a choked voice, "Your sister is so selfish. We need to think about our children. Jake and Tommy need to grow up in a house with a yard, not in this cramped, rented apartment." Marcus, without looking at me, nodded as if confirming her words. "She's right, Samantha." I froze, not believing my ears, and turned to my parents, hoping that at least they would take my side and stop this ridiculous conversation. But then my father spoke up, and his words sounded like a stab in the back. "Sarah is right, honey. They need the house more than you do." My mother nodded in agreement and added, "You need to think about the children." I laughed incredulously, my voice breaking with bitterness. "Then where do you think I'll live?" Sarah, without batting an eyelid, said, "We'll just move into your house." "And you can get your own apartment or something," Marcus intervened, his tone calm, as if he were discussing the most mundane thing. "You make good money, Samantha. You have a high income. You'll be able to buy a new house in no time." And then something began that I will never forget. All 3 of them, Marcus, Sarah, and my parents, as if forgetting that I was sitting next to them, started talking among themselves about how wonderful it would be if Marcus and his family moved into my house. They discussed which room Jake would occupy, how Sarah would finally have a proper kitchen, how great it would be for the children to have a garden created by my own hands. "The living room is much more spacious than the one we have now," Sarah said enthusiastically. "And the children will love this garden that Samantha has so beautifully arranged," my mother added, and her words burned right through me. I sat and listened to them divide my life, my work, my home, as if I had already died and they were reading my will. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my palm on the table with such force that the plates and glasses jumped and said loudly, "I will not give my house to anyone." I stood up, and the chair scraped across the floor. "This is my property, my hard work, my sacrifices. It has nothing to do with you." They looked at me like I was crazy, like I was the one being unreasonable in refusing to give them my house. I grabbed my purse and the bottle of wine I'd brought for the party and said with cold determination, "I don't believe you." "Samantha, sit down," my father said sharply, his voice taking on a commanding tone for the first time. "We're just trying to do what's best for the family." I turned to him. "What's best for the family? What about what's best for me? What about the fact that I worked so hard for this house? Sarah was still sobbing, but her words were clear. Think of Jake and Tommy. They're your nephews. I almost laughed out loud from the helplessness and pain. I thought about them for 3 years when I was paying for your apartment. I shouted and headed for the door. Behind me, they continued their conversation as if I no longer existed. She'll come to her senses, I heard my mother's voice. She just needs time to think about it. This house really would be perfect for us, Sarah added, and I heard her tears miraculously evaporate, replaced by a satisfied intonation. I walked out, slammed the door behind me, and almost ran to the car. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely insert the key into the ignition. Anger and disbelief overwhelmed me. These people, my own family, had just tried to steal my home from me, turning the happiest day of my life into a disgusting, painful nightmare. The drive home seemed like a fog, where every movement of the steering wheel, every gear change felt unreal, and all I had was a painful, endless replay in my head of that horrific conversation that had destroyed my idea of a family just a few hours earlier. I tried to understand how everything had gone downhill so quickly, almost suddenly, as if the ground had slipped out from under my feet, and how my parents, the people who were supposed to protect me, could allow the idea that I was obliged to give them my house without protest. I asked myself over and over again, how could Marcus, my own brother, sit at the same table and nod silently while his wife demanded my property as if it were something natural? When I finally reached my house and closed the door behind me, even before I had time to take off my coat, my phone began to vibrate furiously, as if my entire family had conspired to haunt me within my own walls. I saw the names flashing across the screen one after another: Mom, Dad, Marcus, even Sarah, and each reminder of betrayal burned within me. But I stubbornly ignored them all. It felt like my very breathing was relieved by not answering, as if the silence were my only shield. But soon the screen lit up with more notifications. Text messages now, and though I tried my best not to give in, I couldn't help but open them, as if asking for more pain. The first was from my mother. Samantha, you are being very selfish. Family always comes first. Call me back. The second was from my father. Your mother is upset. You need to apologize and do the right thing, Marcus, with his usual condescension, wrote, Stop acting like a child. We need to talk about this calmly and rationally, and Sarah sent the most poisonous jab. I can't believe you put your personal desires above the needs of your nephews. Shame on you. I deleted all the messages in one go without reading the whole thing, without writing a single word in response. Deep down, I still cherished the naive hope that in a few days, when the emotions had settled, they would come to their senses, realize how absurd it all sounded, and apologize. But I was wrong. The calls and messages continued to come day after day, each one more angry and intrusive than the last, and instead of subsiding, their pressure only grew, eating away at me from the inside. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, there was one strange relief. For the first time in years, my weekend was surprisingly quiet and peaceful. Sarah didn't bring Jake and Tommy over, as she always did, and I suddenly felt relieved, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I was able to rest peacefully in my own home, walk barefoot on a clean floor without worrying about children's shoes getting dirty, and without fearing that someone's careless hands would break something. I enjoyed this new, unexpected silence, like a rare gift from fate, but my peace was short-lived. On Tuesday, when I was sitting in the office and reviewing the estimates of upcoming projects, the secretary knocked carefully on the door. Her voice was a little worried. Samantha, your mother has come to see you. My heart sank painfully. I immediately understood that she would not back down so easily, and that meant another battle awaited me. Invite her, I answered, although every cell of my body resisted this meeting. Mom entered my office with that same sweet smile that I knew from childhood and which she always put on when she needed something. She sat down in the chair across from my desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were on a friendly visit. "I wanted to talk to you about the house situation," she began, her voice soft. "I think you may have rushed into it a little bit." "Rushed?" I asked, anger rising inside me. "Mom, this is my house. I bought it. I paid for it. I live in it. There's no decision to be made." She shook her head and sighed. "But Samantha, think of Marcus and Sarah. They really need this. You've done so well in your business." She gestured at my office with its spacious windows, neatly organized paperwork, and the flower in the corner that I'd cherished. "Look at all this. You could easily afford another house." I looked at her with disbelief, as if she were a stranger. "Do you have any idea how much effort this has cost me?" My voice wavered. "I haven't had a vacation in 9 years. I've been driving the same old truck, wearing faded clothes, eating instant noodles for dinner, just so that every extra dollar would go toward paying the mortgage." Mom smiled as if I was being silly. "I know, honey. But you're still in a much better position than Marcus and Sarah. They have children to think about." I clenched my fists. What about me? What about what I want? What about the fact that I love my home and my garden, where every tree was planted by my own hands? My mother's face was frozen in that stubborn expression that I remembered all too well from my childhood, when no amount of reasoning had any effect. "Samantha, you are being selfish. Family should help family. You should be generous, after all. You have achieved so much." They repeated the word selfish over and over, as if it were a sharp weapon that could cut me to the heart, and each time I heard it, it became harder to breathe, because it seemed that simply wanting to preserve what I had worked for my entire adult life made me look like some kind of monster. I felt like if I stayed in that room another minute, I would suffocate from the injustice, so I stood up abruptly, walked to the door, and said coldly, "Mom, I need you to go." I opened the door, trying not to show how much my hands were shaking, and added, "You should be ashamed of yourself for so obviously playing favorites among your children." She grabbed her purse, stood up, her face flushed angrily, and her voice rang with rage. "You are making a huge mistake, young lady. This family will not forget how you behaved." I straightened up and, looking straight into her eyes, replied, "Very well. Maybe then you will finally leave me alone." Mom turned abruptly and ran out of the office, and for a long time I listened to her heels angrily clicking down the hall, as if they were minting a sentence. A week passed, and suddenly my phone was ringing off the hook again, but now it wasn't just my parents calling. It was relatives I'd barely spoken to in years. Aunt Carol, 2 states away, was calling several times a day. Cousin Mike, whom I hadn't seen in 5 years, was texting out of the blue. Even Great-Uncle Henry, whom I'd only known from the occasional wedding or funeral, was showing up. Each of them started with the same thing. "Samantha, honey, I was talking to your mother," or "We heard you're having problems at home." Aunt Carol, speaking in a soft, almost sympathetic tone, said, "Samantha, honey, I'm so worried about you. Your mother said you're not very nice to your brother and his family. Is it true that they asked you to give them your house?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Did she really say that?" I clarified. "Well," my aunt hesitated, "she mentioned that Marcus and Sarah needed more space for the kids." I couldn't resist asking, "Aunt Carol, would you give your house to someone else?" There was a pause on the other end. "Well, that's different," she said hesitantly. "It's not the same situation." I snapped back. "How is it different?" But still didn't get an answer. When I asked Cousin Mike the same question, he simply hung up, as if he was embarrassed by his own silence. And Uncle Henry mumbled something about having to go and quickly ended the conversation. It was crystal clear. My mother had been calling everyone, telling her version of events, portraying me as a cruel and ungrateful daughter, a selfish woman who had supposedly betrayed the family. It was a sophisticated manipulation, and the scale of it shocked me. Another 2 weeks passed. I had already begun to hope that all of this was finally over. The calls had stopped, Silence had returned to my home, and I was able to once again immerse myself in work and enjoy the rare moments of peace. I even caught myself thinking that for the first time in a long time I felt an inner balance, as if life was gradually returning to its usual tracks. But one Saturday morning, the peace was mercilessly shattered. I was awakened by loud voices and the low rumble of trucks coming from outside my bedroom window. At first I thought it was probably one of the neighbors moving, but the sounds grew louder, the footsteps and voices getting closer. I quickly threw on a robe and went out into the yard to see what was going on. What I saw made my blood run cold. A huge moving truck was parked right in my driveway, and two workers in blue overalls were unloading furniture and boxes. And in the middle of all this chaos, as if in charge, stood Sarah, waving her arms confidently and giving out directions. She pointed at my house and said, "The couch is obviously in the living room. And be careful with those boxes. They contain children's toys." Marcus stood next to her, his arms crossed over his chest as if this was the most normal thing to happen. And a little further away, Jake and Tommy stood huddled together, their expressions confused and even a little scared. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe, and I walked straight to Sarah, feeling the rage welling up inside me. "What the hell is going on here?" I screamed. Sarah turned to me with that same false, innocent expression that always drove me nuts and said sweetly, "Oh, Samantha, we're moving." "I hope you don't mind that we're starting early." "Moving?" My voice broke. "Are you completely crazy?" At that moment, Marcus walked up to me, trying to look calm and reasonable. "Samantha, there's no need to make a scene," he said evenly. "We talked about this. Let us just move our things in and we'll discuss the details later." I stepped closer and looked him straight in the eye. "We didn't talk about anything." "I told you no. This is my house." Sarah came closer to me, and in her eyes I could clearly see the cold glint of manipulation, the same game she always used to get others to give in to her. She folded her arms over her chest and said almost solemnly, "Samantha, we broke the lease. We have nowhere else to go." Her voice wavered, as if she were trying to feign desperation, but I knew her too well to be fooled by that tone. She turned and called to the children, "Jake, Tommy, come here." The boys approached slowly, their heads down, and looked as if they were ashamed to be part of this whole spectacle. "Aura," Sarah said loudly and dramatically, a nickname I had hated since I was a child, like a blow to my nerves. "You wouldn't dare throw your nephews out on the street, would you?" She pushed the boys forward as if they were human shields, and a smug smile appeared on her face, in which there was no embarrassment, only the certainty that now I was cornered and had to submit. But at that very moment I felt a surge of determination. She had made a huge mistake, because once again she had underestimated me. I turned to the movers, who seemed to be increasingly unaware of what they had gotten themselves into, and spoke loudly, clearly, so that every word could be heard. "Excuse me, gentlemen, but you are currently on private property without permission. This is trespassing. If you do not leave immediately, I will call the police and have you all taken straight to the station." The movers froze as if they were nailed to the ground, and one of them looked at Marcus doubtfully. "Dude," he said, "you said this was your sister's place and that she was fine with it." "So she's really fine with it?" Marcus stepped forward and spoke quickly, trying to control the situation. "Samantha, stop being so dramatic." But I almost shouted back, "I'm not fine with it. This is my home, and you have no right to be here." The movers looked at each other, their faces showing that they had seen this before, and they knew better than to get involved in family squabbles. Without another word, they began loading the furniture back into the truck. "No, wait!" Sarah screamed, rushing towards them. "Don't listen to her. We paid you to move our stuff." But the men obviously decided that no amount of money was worth a police investigation and continued calmly carrying away the boxes. A few minutes later, everything they had managed to carry was back in the truck. Sarah was furious, her face contorted, and she screamed at me, calling me a selfish and heartless woman who, according to her, had no compassion. Marcus came closer and tried to grab my arm. "Samantha, be reasonable. We are your family." I pulled away abruptly and said firmly, "Get off my property now." But Sarah wasn't going to give in. She ran up to my front door and kicked it hard, screaming that I was unfair, that I had ruined their lives. I pulled out my phone and said coldly, holding back the trembling in my voice, "I'm calling the police right now." "You have 30 seconds to leave my territory." Finally, these words got through to them. Marcus grabbed Sarah by the arm and pulled her away from the door. They quickly loaded the children into the car, and as they drove away, Sarah leaned out of the window, continuing to shout curses and accusations at me, her voice echoing down the street for a long time. Half an hour later, the phone rang. I knew who it was, and I didn't answer it. My parents called again and again, leaving angry voicemails, but I deleted them without even listening to them. Later, in the evening, a message came from Marcus. "You owe us money for a new apartment. Because of you, we have nowhere to live." I laughed out loud as I read this, a laugh that was unexpectedly loud and liberating. I replied, "From today on, I will no longer help you. Not a single dollar. You sort this out." A hail of angry messages rained down on me, full of accusations and reproaches, but I deleted each one without even opening it, as if cutting off the poisonous threads that had been trying to entangle me for so long. A couple of weeks passed in relative peace. I was completely immersed in work, working on a large landscaping project for a new shopping center, drawing up plans, choosing plants, thinking through every detail. Returning home in the evening, I felt tired, but also quietly happy that life had finally returned to normal. But one day, returning at dusk, I froze on the threshold. My heart literally froze, because before me opened a sight that made my eyes darken. My beautiful garden was destroyed. The plants were torn out of the ground and lay in the dirt. The flowers I had grown with such love were mercilessly trampled, and the carefully laid paths were mangled, as if someone had deliberately trampled them with hatred. It was as if someone had taken a shovel or a crowbar and deliberately destroyed everything I had worked so hard to create, everything that had been my little refuge. I sank to my knees, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. Years of work, hours of care, every morning spent among these flowers, all destroyed in one night. A wave of pain and anger rose in my chest, and although I had suspicions about who could have done this, I understood that suspicion alone was not enough. I needed proof. I rushed to my laptop, barely holding back the trembling in my hands, and turned it on as quickly as I could. A few years ago, when there had been a series of brazen break-ins in our neighborhood, I had installed security cameras around the entire property, carefully positioned to cover every corner of my yard and garden. And of course, my family never knew about it, because I was beginning to understand that it was better to keep certain precautions to myself. I opened the footage from earlier that day, and my heart sank as the screen illuminated familiar figures. Marcus and Sarah, clear, distinct, without a doubt. The video showed them methodically, as if with a premeditated plan, destroying my garden. Sarah laughing loudly with an almost evil joy as she tore my roses out of the ground, the very ones that had once won a prize at a city competition. Marcus, grim and stubborn, was destroying paths, breaking bushes, and it all looked like they were enjoying the process of destruction itself, like it was their twisted way of showing me their power. I downloaded the video to my phone, grabbed my keys, and without a single call or warning, headed straight to my parents' house. When I walked in, the whole family was gathered. My parents were sitting at the table, Marcus and Sarah were in the living room, the children were playing in the corner. My mother, noticing me, looked up and asked in surprise, "Samantha, what are you doing here?" Sarah's lips slightly lifted, as if enjoying my anger and the fact that I was furious. I took a step forward and said in an even voice, "Someone destroyed my garden today." Sarah immediately shrugged, feigning surprise and false innocence. "Oh no, it's terrible. There are so many troublemakers around these days." I nodded, keeping my cool. "Yes, there are. That's why I'm going to the police to find these criminals, especially since I have all this on video. I picked up the phone and pressed play. The room was silent, broken only by the sound of the recording. There on the screen, Marcus and Sarah were destroying my garden, their faces clear, every gesture, every emotion. The color drained from their faces, and even the children stopped playing, staring at the screen. My parents sat in complete shock, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. "I'm going to sue you both," I said, feeling my own calm now giving me strength. "And I'm going to post the video on social media so everyone can see what you really are." "Samantha, please," my mother pleaded, her voice shaking. "Don't do this to my family." I turned to her and asked coldly, "What exactly should I not do? Seek justice for my destroyed property? Show people the truth about what they've done?" Marcus finally found the strength to speak. "Samantha, we can solve this. Leave the police out of it." I looked him straight in the eye and said firmly, "You have exactly 1 week to pay me $3,000 for the damages. If you don't, I'll file a report and post the video everywhere. Everyone will know what you did." $3,000? Sarah gasped, as if she had heard something impossible. "We don't have that kind of money." I chuckled. "Then you better find it. You had enough money to break the lease and hire movers. Figure it out yourself." With that, I turned and walked out without another word, leaving a stunned silence behind me. Exactly 7 days later, a wire transfer from Marcus for $3,000 appeared in my bank account, followed by a short message, "We never want to see you again." I laughed out loud because the idea that I wanted to see them was so absurd that it seemed like a joke. A couple of months had passed since then. I invested the money I received into restoring the garden, and now it is more beautiful than ever. New flowers, neat paths, fresh flower beds. Every detail was created with love and a desire to turn destruction into renewal. My business was also flourishing. Projects were bringing in a good income, and long-awaited peace had finally come to my life. From mutual friends, I learned that Marcus and his family had moved in with my parents, and now 6 people were huddled in a 3-room house. Everyone complained that it had become cramped, that expenses had increased, and Sarah drove them crazy with her endless demands and nagging. But frankly, I didn't care anymore. Sometimes in the evenings I sit in my garden, listen to the birds singing, admire the sunset, and think about how everything could have been different if my family had simply been happy for me, if they had celebrated my success instead of trying to take it away. But then I realized that I am only better off without them. I would always prefer to be alone in my home, full of silence, beauty, and the work of my own hands, than surrounded by people who see me only as a source of money and free things.